My first experience with business fraud came about 2 weeks into my first full-time position working for an accounting firm. Now, this was a smaller firm with a sole practitioner. That means it was owned and run by one accountant. However, the clients were quite large for privately owned companies. Well, I knew almost nothing about accounting at that point and very little about bookkeeping, but they were willing to give me a chance and employed me. 2 weeks into the job, I was called into the partner's office and he said, go down to one of my clients. There's customer cards all over the floor. Put them into alphabetical order. So I assumed he knew that I knew the order of the alphabet. So I went down there, and while I was looking all over the floor and in drawers and everywhere else for these customer cards, they were talking about money being missing and people were crying and there was stealing and but they weren't really talking to me. They was kind of talking among themselves, but I could overhear it. At the end of the day, my employer called me and said, come into the office before you go back there in the morning. So when we met early in the morning, he sat me in his conference room, which was a room that he used primarily for important meetings. And he said, I want you to go down there and find out if money was missing, how much was missing, and find out how they did it. Now, this absolutely shocked me because there were certainly more qualified people in the office than me to determine what a fraud was. But I went down there and I began to look at the way things were recorded. And knowing a little bit about bookkeeping, a little bit about business management, I realized that there was two people in a finance department for a retail chain. This was before Visa and MasterCard. And they were entrusted with receiving the money, posting the payments, making the bank deposits, and every single financial aspect of the organization. Now, I knew very well that you shouldn't have that kind of lack of separation of duties. So I began looking at it, and I noticed that there had been daily reports run off a very large bookkeeping machine in those days, and the paper tape was broken in the middle and stitched back together again with staples. Day after day after day of reports that I pulled out revealed the same thing. Then I began to realize that money wasn't being deposited as it was being received. It was being held for Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, especially the checks. Because on Thursday and Friday and Saturday, that was when the neighborhood and the local customers in their main store would come in to pay their bills in cash. And somehow, then I looked further and I found out that there was very tiny amounts of money being deposited. Some days, literally, cash was being deposited for 27 cents or 82 cents. Now, when you make a payment on an account, you tend to pay it in dollars, $5, $10, $20, not in 18 cents or 27 cents or whatever that was. So I kept looking and looking, and slowly I understood what they did and wrote a report. It was about a 30-page report of roughly 3 years of transactions that totaled out to the amount that they could collect from their insurance company. I turned in my report and I never said another word. Here are some of the things I found out. Number one, the two employees were paid minimum wage or almost minimum wage. Along the way, I heard conversations that they would come into work with these bags of groceries from a very expensive grocery store and nobody could understand how they got those fancy groceries. I began to figure it out pretty quickly. They came in wearing clothing that was far more expensive than what the company sold in its own stores. So how did they get that expensive clothing? Well, apparently from the same source of money. And I began hearing that every year the accountant, that was my employer, would alter the books to add up to what the customers' cards would say they owed instead of what the company said it was owed and instead of investigating. I also realized, which he didn't tell me and I didn't discuss with him, was that he could never have possibly performed the audit that he was being paid to do and that he had signed an engagement to do and that he wrote on his report that he'd performed an audit. The reason I knew this was because all of the source documents that I went through had never been looked at. And 3 full years of documents, there should have been some audit somewhere over some period of time. There was nothing. The next thing I learned was that the two women said, if you audit our department, we're going to quit. Though I had 2 weeks of training before I got this assignment, I realized that's a threat you have to take very seriously. Apparently they didn't. Well, not a word was said to me afterwards. The report was in, my employer never said a word to me, and it disappeared. A few months went by and I was walking into the office And the receptionist was talking to me and she says, "Hey, do you ever know what happened with that fraud report?" And I said, "No." "Well, I'll tell you." So she knew. And I learned something new also. When you want to find out what's going on inside of an organization, you ask the secretaries, receptionists, clerks. You don't ask executives. These people know what's going on anyway, and they're more likely to tell you what's going on. Well, it turned out they brought the report to these two women, and the two women showed them their defense. Now, the company was being run by through an inheritance. It was two sons who were the children of the founders. Their mother was still working there. The father had passed away, and she seemed to be in pretty weak physical condition at that point. And when they showed their defense, though I had written, as it turned out, an airtight report that I could have had them arrested and put in prison, they walked away. Now, the two owners of it were well known in the community, were married, had kids, always in the best of schools, and everybody knew who they were. So the two women showed their defense. Each two items of defense, one with each of the two men with their mistresses. And they simply said, if you arrest us, we're going to send these pictures to your wives. And the case ended very quietly. I quickly understood that fraud didn't necessarily end up with someone getting arrested or sued or accused. It may have had a whole different ending. As my career in business fraud began, this company had lost so much money to this fraud that their career in business had ended.